Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Tehman Tariq, Senior Manager of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. So to start things off, I have a couple questions for our listeners. What if the security scanner that protects your CI/CD pipeline was actually the attacker's way in? Or what if updating a software package that your organization has trusted for years silently handed your credentials to a North Korean hacker? Well, that's what we're diving into today. Tehman, I'm sure you've heard about the Trivy incident. It's been all over the news lately. You know, March 2026 and 75 GitHub version tags were hijacked in a widely used security scanner. And this was not just compromised once. It was actually the second breach of the same tool in a single month.
Right. And as you mentioned, John, Trivy is the vulnerability scanner. Organizations trust it to find their security problems, right? But in this case, an information stealer was deployed to its code library. And that was able to steal credentials from every production pipeline that was running that software.
Yeah, exactly. And, kind of the scary thing is that was not the only NPM supply chain attack recently. So then we layer in the Axios compromise, where North Korean threat actors spent weeks socially engineering the maintainer of a package, and that package had nearly 100 million weekly downloads. One compromised maintainer account, millions of downstream victims.
Absolutely. And what connects these incidents is the attack surface. There's the human element in the maintainers and the software packages they control that many organizations are using every single day.
Yeah, and there's a fundamental question here, which is how do organizations defend when a user outside their network is compromised and the software that user controls silently updates? Well, that's what we're answering today. All right, so let's start it off, Tehman, with the Axios story. Walk me through how the North Korean actors were able to pull this off.
Yep, absolutely. And first, it started by them targeting NPM packages specifically. So for our listeners that are not as aware, the NPM ecosystem is the foundation of modern JavaScript development. This includes a wide range of software packages that receive billions of downloads every single week. They power everything from Fortune 500 web applications all the way to embedded systems. That scale alone makes it a very strategic target. All an attacker has to do is compromise one widely used package, and they've weaponized the supply chain to hit tons of organizations downstream. And as you can imagine, that's a nightmare, right? But in reality is that it's happening right now. A North Korean threat group, UNC 1069, has systematically targeted high-impact NPM package maintainers from late 2025 all the way to early 2026. And they didn't just go after Axios. They targeted a wide range of maintainers that led to many different packages. The campaign was patient. It was weeks and weeks of week-long social engineering efforts that were designed to exploit individual trust.
Yeah, and there's a critical point there that I really want to hammer home. So the package that UNC 1069 compromised had received 100 million weekly downloads. And it kind of put this into layman's terms, it's not just a popular package, but instead it can be compared to critical infrastructure for the JavaScript ecosystem. So our listeners really need to know, Tehman, how did attackers actually get access to that maintainer's account?
Yep, absolutely. And it's something that a lot of our listeners have already heard, a few times this year alone, but specifically they used a click fix style of social engineering attack. So that's where the threat actor first worked for weeks to gain targets trusted by impersonating legitimate organizations. The maintainer joined what they thought was a video call about a collaboration effort. And what ends up popping up for that user is a fake error message that prompts them to install what appeared to be a software update. But instead of downloading a software update, it deployed a remote access Trojan that harvested NPM publishing credentials, browser session cookies, cloud credentials, and password manager data as well.
Yeah, all right. So that's a great summary of one of the recent NPM supply chain attacks. But we'd also mentioned the Trivy attacks. Can you give us a quick summary of what happened with those?
Yep, absolutely. And really what we saw was between late February and March of 2026, threat group Team PCP conducted a highly calculated sequence of supply chain attacks. What they did is they systematically compromised widely trusted open source security tools, including vulnerability scanners such as Trivy and KICS, and the popular AI gateway Light LLM. These attacks injected malicious InfoStealer payloads directly into GitHub Actions and Python package index registries. So something to note is that these payloads execute automatically to silently extract that highly sensitive access tokens as routine automated workflows are already running. And across both these attacks, there are a few things that I want to highlight specifically. The first one is that threat actors are using proven tactics on new targets. So historically, what we've seen is that DPRK linked threat actors targeted crypto founders and venture capitalists. Now they have pivoted to targeting open source maintainers because their access provides leverage to the software packages they control, such as an Axios. So critically here, they're following the same playbook. They identify individuals with those huge potential downstream impact, then exploit the human trust through social engineering. And the second is many supply chain attacks. So Trivy, Shai Hulud, all of those, for example, are clear case studies of how CI/CD compromise leads to cascading credential theft. Attackers will steal credentials from pipelines that ran the malicious versions, then use those credentials to publish additional malicious NPM packages, creating a self-propagating attack chain.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just want to restate here and make sure it's crystal clear. So not only do they release a bunch of malicious packages, but they also deploy tools like information stealers and Trufflehog to steal access tokens and secrets organization-wide. The new stolen credentials are then used to publish more malicious packages under new accounts, ultimately creating that vicious cycle.
Exactly. And that actually leads me to my final point. In the Trivy attack, we saw incomplete remediation. Attackers returned to exploit credentials that weren't fully rotated after the first breach. This really shows that the incident response for supply chain compromise requires a completely different level of thinking. So, John, when you look at how these attacks actually succeeded, what are the factors that enabled them specifically?
Yeah, there's a few things. And to start things off, there's one major risk of these open source projects, and it really lies in the maintainers or the people who preserve the software packages. And, this was something we had called out in ReliaQuest 2026 predictions report, specifically around how threat actors were highly likely to target these maintainers. And just to kind of bring to surface some of the stats that we had highlighted in that report, there are close to 12 million of these open source packages, 7 million of which were maintained by a single person. Additionally, nearly half of the 13,000 most downloaded NPM packages relied on one maintainer, really highlighting the risk behind them. And that risk then becomes exploited through highly targeted social engineering to compromise the maintainer's account, just like we're seeing here now with UNC 1069's attack against the Axios maintainer. In that attack, they spent weeks building rapport with the maintainer, communicating slowly using impersonation. They first approached him pretending to be a founder of a well-known company whose profile they cloned off of LinkedIn. The threat actors then invited that maintainer to a Slack workspace, and that workspace had company branding, impersonation branding all throughout it, even to the point where the threat actors had channels in that Slack communication where they were posting company branded LinkedIn posts, really helping support that social engineering premise. From there, they scheduled video calls that included links, and within the meeting link was the ClickFix style attack that deployed the rat once the maintainer accessed it. Now, some quick context. If you're not familiar with ClickFix, it's really just a copy paste style attack where a malicious web page displays an error message that gets the user to copy and execute some malicious commands. And previously we've seen some executions of this where the web page is displaying an error message, or it's pretending to be a CAPTCHA that verify you are human and gets the user to execute the commands through that. And throughout ClickFix evolution, I'd say those are now more trivial means of the execution. But I want to bring a key point here. We've seen North Koreans throughout their contagious interview campaign use ClickFix, and I think there's something that's likely happening here too. Specifically, the error message gets displayed at the end of that video software. And think about it. As we join calls through like Zoom or Slack or what have you, it's very often that we have to configure our camera and our microphone when joining those calls. Well, that's what the click fix error message displayed and was able to convince a software developer to execute those commands. So I just really want to highlight here how, more advanced threat actors, like the North Korean threat actors in this case, are able to use those more advanced tactics to have a higher likelihood of the execution. It's very hard to notice for a user to understand that they're falling victim to a click fix attack with the more advanced tactics like that. So bringing things back, by the time that the maintainer actually realized they had been compromised with a rat, the attacker had already harvested NPM publishing credentials and pushed malicious versions.
And to add to this, the rat Waveshaper version 2 didn't just steal NPM tokens. It harvested everything from browser session cookies to cloud credentials and password manager data. So think if this was a software developer within our organization. How much effort would be needed to manually reset each one of those harvested secrets?
Yeah, it's a good point, because it really becomes difficult to remediate everything that's stolen from these info stealers. It becomes an operational challenge quickly, but it's really critically important to get right, because incomplete remediation leads to follow-on attacks and amplified impact. As we mentioned, the Trivy compromise was a two-part attack. The first involved a tool called HackerBot-Claw, and it exposed maintainer credentials. Well, the credential remediation and rotation that took place after that was incomplete, and not every secret that was stolen was rotated. Well, the attackers took advantage of that, using the still valid credentials to compromise the software and deploy more malicious packages a second time. So when defenders rotate credentials after a supply chain compromise, I think they often focus on the immediately obvious things, API keys, access tokens, but can often overlook things like session cookies and cloud roles. And that's the gap that attackers will exploit and continue where they left off. So across all the NPM attacks, the ones we're covering today and previous ones like Shah Halud, there's one major element here that really makes them successful, and that's the automatic integration of open source package updates through the CI/CD pipeline. And the fundamental element of that, which makes continuous integration and continuous deployment so powerful, is the automatic building and deploying of code changes. But that same powerful element is what attackers are now exploiting to deploy their malicious code. And really, due to the volume of the NPM supply chain attacks that we've seen, organizations really need to rethink how they handle that CI/CD pipeline. So far in the episode, here's what we've established. One maintainer gets socially engineered. Your CI/CD pipeline automatically pulls in the malicious update, no questions asked. An incomplete remediation hands an attacker a second shot weeks later. 3 distinct failure points: the human layer, the pipeline, and the incident response process. How do defenders actually close those gaps? Well, that's what we're digging into after the break.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Now let's talk about what defenders can actually do against supply chain attacks. All right, first question, Tehman. If the problem is that malicious package versions can ship to production before the community is able to detect them, then how do organizations create a detection window without breaking software continuity?
John, one of the simplest high-impact defenses that most organizations aren't implementing is taking a minimum 1-week delay before consuming new or updated package versions. So let's talk through this further. When a new version of Axios or any dependency gets published to NPM, don't pull it immediately. Let it sit in the registry for 7 to 30 days. That gives the security community time to analyze it and identify any sort of anomalies.
Yeah, so just to restate that here, Tehman, you're not saying never update, but rather update deliberately after the community review window has passed. And this really wouldn't have stopped the Axios maintainer from getting compromised because that's outside most organizations' control. But it would have prevented organizations from immediately consuming the malicious versions before the community caught it.
Right. Both malicious Axios versions were detected and removed within just a few hours. Organizations can use a few different methods to help control this deployment. The first one is timed rollouts. So implement a pre-configured time delay, allowing time to cancel if deemed necessary. The second one is having those manual trigger jobs, so configuring pipelines to build but not deploy until a human manually has approved it. And the final one is scheduled pipelines, so setting up some sort of cron-based triggers to run pipelines at a specific time schedule. Now let's talk about one of the harder problems. How do you defend against the human element? How do you protect your organization from UNC 1069 style social engineering attacks?
Well, it's a really good question, because social engineering is a tough challenge. And so far in this episode, we've talked about how the open source maintainers were targeted with social engineering. And that might make it seem like it's a threat only specific to the technology sector or like it's another organization's problem. But I think it's really important to understand that the same targeting can occur for software developers or even VIPs within your organization. Remember that the North Korean threat actors already changed targets as it suited them. They originally started with those crypto founders and venture capitalists and then moved into maintainers. So the targeting switch is likely to happen again. Not to mention, social engineering is widely used by a range of threat actors. 1 in 4 attacks that ReliaQuest observed in 2025 used social engineering. But the question you had set up is, how do organizations defend against it? And I think one major element here is going to be end user training. But, we had a really good discussion around this with some of our security leaders, and it's really not just about crying wolf and assigning the organization another email security training. It needs to be quick and targeted. So to kind of break that down for our listeners, I think there are 2 major points that it needs to be targeted around. Number 1, recognizing impersonation over the phone or through social media platforms like LinkedIn, and really getting users to understand that they need to use outside channels to verify, right? Verified channels they can find on Google, things like approved emails or company phone numbers, remove that conversation out of the direct conversation and verify with a secondary source. And then the second one is going to be around ClickFix. Tehman, as you mentioned, we've talked about ClickFix a lot on the podcast. We've seen it a lot, and users need to be able to recognize copy paste abuse. It was used to deliver 59% of the top malware families in 2025, again, by a wide range of threat actors. So Tehman, we've mentioned that social engineering includes multiple elements of brand impersonation, such as VIP impersonation and branded infrastructure. If this impersonation is used to target employees within an organization, are there any detection methods available?
Absolutely. And what we've seen is the digital footprint created by the threat actors is actually your alert mechanism. So in the attacks we've seen, attackers use social media like LinkedIn to impersonate those VIPs, those company websites, and those Slack channels that host company brand imagery and help support their social engineering. Organizations need to monitor for these resources on the open web so they can be detected as soon as they are created and then taken down immediately.
Yeah, that's a really good recommendation, Tehman, because often it's hard for organizations to detect attacks early on in that resource development stage of the MITRE attack kill chain before the attack really starts. But the web monitoring that you just mentioned can really do that. And so the final defense recommendation that I want to call out here is around the incomplete credential rotation we highlighted earlier. And I think this is a really good place where automation can help. Often when we speak of automated remediation and the value that it provides, we talk about speed and how it can act much faster than a human. And that's certainly true. But I think there's another important element here, which is consistency. One of the challenges in the Trivy attack was that not all the compromised credentials were rotated, and that allowed the attacker to compromise the software again. I think the issue really came down to the fact that there was just so much compromised, it was difficult to remediate it all, especially manually, to reset all those passwords, session tokens, and access keys. question I have for organizations is going to be, can you guarantee that all the compromised credentials get reset when this happens? Well, I think automation really can. And once a playbook is set up, it can be automatically executed across all those credentials, ensuring that gaps are not left open.
As we start to close, true resilience against supply chain attacks isn't about reacting after malicious code ships. It's about delaying pipeline updates to create a community detection window, training your staff to recognize impersonation and click fix style attacks, as well as monitoring the open web for phishing infrastructure and automating that credential rotation. To close things out, for security leaders, there's a few major takeaways I want everyone to hear. First, it's that CI/CD pipeline configuration should be used as a direct supply chain control. When Axios and Trivy were compromised, organizations set to auto-update had no window to detect or respond. That malicious code went straight to stealing credentials. A deliberate time delay policy before consuming new or updated package versions will create that detection window. And the second piece that I want to mention is that brand monitoring as an early warning system for phishing infrastructure. In these attacks, threat actors built convincing fake identities and branded infrastructure before a single malicious payload was ever delivered. Monitoring the open web for those unauthorized use of your brand, your executive identities, and that company imagery gives your security team the ability to detect and take down that infrastructure before it gets weaponized against you. And the real morning action call for leaders is that this week, ask your security team and your DevOps teams to walk through how your organizations responded to the Axios and the Shai-Hulud compromises. Which credentials were rotated? Were any missed? Does your current IR playbook account for the full scope of secrets exposed in a supply chain event? I'm not just talking about API keys, but I'm also including session cookies, SSH keys, and those cloud roles as well. And how much of that rotation can be automated to guarantee consistency the next time it happens? If nobody can answer that last question confidently, you've just identified your highest priority supply chain gap.
Yeah, those are some good takeaways for security leaders. I'm going to take it home for the practitioner side. Number one, defenders really need to assess what detection and response capability you have in place for click-fix style attacks. As a reminder, ClickFix was used to deliver 59% of the top malware families. You need detection and automated remediation for copy-paste abuse. Next, deliver a quick, targeted social engineering awareness session or email for your VIPs, your administrators, and your developers, not a generic security awareness model. Focus on those two threats we called out, such as multi-platform impersonation, where attackers build trust through platforms like LinkedIn with things like fake branded workspaces and collaboration invites before delivering the payload. And then the second piece of the training should be focused around click-fix style prompts and copy-paste abuse. Your morning action for practitioners, tomorrow, pull up your last red team exercise and check one thing. Does it include social engineering scenarios targeting your developers, your admins, and your VIPs? Again, not just phishing link click rates, but well-crafted impersonation campaigns through social media and with brand impersonation. As a reminder, that Axios maintainer wasn't compromised by a suspicious email. He was compromised by weeks of carefully built trust. And if your red team isn't testing for that, then you don't have a full picture of your human attack surface. To close here, the NPM ecosystem is only as secure as the most vulnerable maintainer, and the attackers know it. The question isn't whether your dependencies will be targeted. The question is whether you'll detect it before malicious code ships to production. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send your emails to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. And please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode right to your podcast platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It'll make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.